chateau of Prince Polignac, Anthony Trollope. Few Englishmen or Englishwomen are intimately acquainted with the little town of La Puy. It is the capital of the old province of La Valais, which also is now but little known, even to French ears, for it is in these days called by the imperial name of the department of the Haute-Loire. It is to the southeast of Auvergne, and is nearly in the center of the southern half of France. But few towns, merely as towns, can be better worth visiting. In the first place, the volcanic formation of the ground on which it stands is not only singular in the extreme, so as to be interesting to the geologist, but it is so picturesque as to be equally gratifying to the general tourist. Within a narrow valley there stand several rocks, rising up from the ground with absolute abruptness. Round two of these the town clusters, and a third stands but a mile distant, forming the center of a faubourg, or suburb. These rocks appear to be, and I believe are, the harder particles of volcanic matter, which have not been carried away through successive ages by the joint agency of water and air. When the tide of lava ran down between the hills the surface left was no doubt on a level with the heads of these rocks, but here and there the deposit became harder than elsewhere, and these harder points have remained, lifting up their steep heads in a line through the valley. The highest of these is called the Roche de Cornay. Round this and up its steep sides the town stands. On its highest summit there was an old castle, and there now is, or will be before these pages are printed, a colossal figure in bronze of the Virgin Mary, made from the cannon taken at Sebastopol. Halfway down the hill the cathedral is built, a singularly gloomy edifice Romanesque, as it is called, in its style, but extremely similar in its mode of architecture to what we know of Byzantine structures. But there has been no surface on the rock side large enough to form a resting place for the church, which has therefore been built out on huge supporting piles, which form a porch below the west front, so that the approach is by numerous steps laid along the side of the wall below the church, forming a wondrous flight of stairs. Let all men who may find themselves stopping at La Puy visit the top of these stairs at the time of the setting sun, and look down from thence through the framework of the porch on the town beneath, and at the hillside beyond. Behind the church is the seminary of the priests, with its beautiful walks stretching round the Roche de Cornay, and overlooking the town and valley below. Next to this rock, and within a quarter of a mile of it, is the second peak, called the Rock of the Needle. It rises narrow, sharp, and abrupt from the valley, allowing of no buildings on its sides. But on its very point has been erected a church sacred to Saint Michael, that lover of rock summits, accessible by stairs cut from the stone. Perhaps this rock, I mean, is the most wonderful of the wonders which nature has formed at La Puy. Above this, at a mile's distance, is the Rock of Espali, formed in the same way, and almost equally precipitous. On its summit is a castle, having its own legend, and professing to have been the residence of Charles VII, when little of France belonged to its kings but the provinces of Berry, Auvergne, and La Valais. Some 3 miles farther up there is another volcanic rock, larger, indeed, but equally sudden in its spring, equally remarkable as rising abruptly from the valley, on which stands the castle and old family residence of the House of Polignac. It was lost by them at the Revolution, but it was repurchased by the minister of Charles X, and is still the property of the head of the race. La Puy itself is a small, moderate, pleasant French town, in which the language of the people has not the pure Parisian aroma, nor is the glory of the boulevards of the capital emulated in its streets. These are crooked, narrow, steep, and intricate, forming here and there excellent sketches for a lover of street picturesque beauty, but hurtful to the feet with their small, round-topped paving stones, and not always as clean as pedestrian ladies might desire. And now I would ask my readers to join me at the morning table d'hôte at the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs. It will of course be understood that this does not mean a breakfast in the ordinary fashion of England, consisting of tea or coffee, bread and butter, and perhaps a boiled egg. It comprises all the requisites for a composite dinner, excepting soup, and as one gets farther south in France, this meal is called dinner. It is, however, eaten without any prejudice to another similar and somewhat longer meal at 6 or 7 o'clock, which, when the above name is taken up by the earlier enterprise, is styled supper. The déjeuner, or dinner, at the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs, on the morning in question, though very elaborate, was not a very gay affair. There were some 14 persons present, of whom half were residents in the town, men employed in some official capacity, who found this to be the cheapest, the most luxurious, and to them the most comfortable mode of living. They clustered together at the head of the table, and as they were customary guests at the house, they talked their little talk together. It was very little and made the most of the good things before them. Then there were 2 or 3 commerce voyagers, a chance traveller or 2, and an English lady with a young daughter. The English lady sat next to one of the accustomed guests, but he, unlike the others, held converse with her rather than with them. Our story at present has reference only to that lady and to that gentleman, place or dames. We will speak first of the lady, whose name was Mrs. Thompson. She was, shall I say, a young woman of about 36. In so saying, I am perhaps creating a prejudice against her in the minds of some readers, as they will, not unnaturally, suppose her, after such an announcement, to be in truth over 40. Any such prejudice will be unjust. I would have it believed that 36 was the outside, not the inside of her age. She was good-looking, ladylike, and considering that she was an Englishwoman, fairly well-dressed. She was inclined to be rather full in her person, but perhaps not more so than is becoming to ladies at her time of life. She had rings on her fingers and a brooch on her bosom which were of some value, and on the back of her head she wore a jaunty small lace cap, which seemed to tell, in conjunction with her other appointments, that her circumstances were comfortable. The little girl who sat next to her was the youngest of her 2 daughters, and might be about 13 years of age. Her name was Matilda, but infantine circumstances had invested her with the nickname of Mimi, by which her mother always called her. A nice, pretty, playful little girl was Mimi Thompson, wearing 2 long tails of plaited hair hanging behind her head, and inclined occasionally to be rather loud in her sport. Mrs. Thompson had another and an elder daughter, now some 15 years old, who was at school in Le Puy, and it was with reference to her tuition that Mrs. Thompson had taken up a temporary residence at the Hotel des Ambassadors in that town. Lillian Thompson was occasionally invited down to dine or breakfast at the inn, and was visited daily at her school by her mother. When I'm sure that she'll do, I shall leave her there, and go back to England, Mrs. Thompson had said, not in the purest French, to the neighbour who always sat next to her at the table d'hôte, the gentleman, namely, to whom we have above alluded. But still she had remained at Le Puy a month, and did not go, a circumstance which was considered singular, but by no means unpleasant, both by the innkeeper and by the gentleman in question. The facts, as regarded Mrs. Thompson, were as follows: she was the widow of a gentleman who had served for many years in the civil service of the East Indies, and who, on dying, had left her a comfortable income of it matters not how many pounds, but constituting quite a sufficiency to enable her to live at her ease and educate her daughters. Her children had been sent home to England before her husband's death, and after that event she had followed them, but there, though she was possessed of moderate wealth, she had no friends and few acquaintances, and after a little while she had found life to be rather dull. Her customs were not those of England, nor were her propensities English, therefore she had gone abroad, and having received some recommendation of the school at Le Puy, had made her way thither. As it appeared to her that she really enjoyed more consideration at Le Puy than had been accorded to her either at Torquay or Leamington, there she remained from day to day. The total payment required at the Hotel des Ambassadors was but 6 francs daily for herself and 3.5 for her little girl, and where else could she live with a better junction of economy and comfort? And then the gentleman who always sat next to her was so exceedingly civil. The gentleman's name was M. Le Cador. So much she knew, and had learned to call him by his name very frequently. Mimi, too, was quite intimate with M. Le Cador, but nothing more than his name was known of him. But M. Le Cador carried a general letter of recommendation in his face, manner, gait, dress, and tone of voice. In all these respects there was nothing left to be desired, and, in addition to this, he was decorated, and wore the little red ribbon of the Legion of Honor, ingeniously twisted into the shape of a small flower. M. Le Cador might be senior in age to Mrs. Thompson by about 10 years, nor had he about him any of the airs or graces of a would-be young man. His hair, which he wore very short, was grizzled, as was also the small pretence of a whisker which came down about as far as the middle of his ear, but the tuft on his chin was still brown, without a grey hair. His eyes were bright and tender, his voice was low and soft, his hands were very white, his clothes were always new and well-fitting, and a better brushed hat could not be seen out of Paris, nor perhaps in it. Now, during the weeks which Mrs. Thompson had passed at Le Puy, the acquaintance which she had formed with M. Le Cador had progressed beyond the prolonged meals in the cellar manger. He had occasionally sat beside her evening table as she took her English cup of tea in her own room, her bed being duly screened off in its distant niche by becoming curtains, and then he had occasionally walked beside her, as he civilly escorted her to the lions of the place, and he had once accompanied her, sitting on the back seat of a French voiture, when she had gone forth to see something of the surrounding country. On all such occasions she had been accompanied by one of her daughters, and the world of Le Puy had had nothing material to say against her. But still the world of Le Puy had whispered a little, suggesting that M. Le Cador knew very well what he was about. But might not Mrs. Thompson also know as well what she was about? At any rate, everything had gone on very pleasantly since the acquaintance had been made. And now, so much having been explained, we will go back to the elaborate breakfast at the Hotel des Ambassadors. Mrs. Thompson, holding Mimi by the hand, walked into the room some few minutes after the last bell had been rung, and took the place which was now hers by custom. The gentlemen who constantly frequented the house all bowed to her, but Le Cador rose from his seat and offered her his hand. "And how is Miss Mimi this morning?" said he, for 'twas thus he always pronounced her name. Miss Mimi, answering for herself, declared that she was very well, and suggested that Le Cador should give her a fig from off a dish that was placed immediately before him on the table. This Le Cador did, presenting it very elegantly between his 2 fingers, and making a little bow to the little lady as he did so. "Fie, Mimi," said her mother, "why do you ask for the things before the waiter brings them round?" "But, Mamma," said Mimi, speaking English, "Le Cador always gives me a fig every morning." "Le Cador always spoils you, I think," answered Mrs. Thompson, in French. And then they went thoroughly to work at their breakfast. During the whole meal Le Cador attended assiduously to his neighbor, and did so without any evil result, except that one Frenchman with a black moustache, at the head of the table, trod on the toe of another Frenchman with another black moustache, winking as he made the sign just as Le Cador, having selected a bunch of grapes, put it on Mrs. Thompson's plate with infinite grace. "But who among us all is free from such impertinences as these? But Madame really must see the chateau of Prince Polignac before she leaves Le Puy," said Le Cador. "The chateau of who?" asked Mimi, to whose young ears the French words were already becoming familiar. "Prince Polignac, my dear. Well, I really don't know, Le Cador I have seen a great deal of the place already, and I shall be going now very soon, probably in a day or 2, said Mrs. Thompson. "But Madame must positively see the chateau," said Le Cador, very impressively, and then after a pause he added, "If Madame will have the complaisance to commission me to procure a carriage for this afternoon, and will allow me the honor to be her guide, I shall consider myself one of the most fortunate of men." "Oh, yes, Mamma, do go," said Mimi, clapping her hands. "And it is Thursday, and Lillian can go with us." "Be quiet, Mimi, do." "Thank you, no, Le Cador. I could not go today, but I am extremely obliged by your politeness." Le Cador still pressed the matter, and Mrs. Thompson still declined till it was time to rise from the table. She then declared that she did not think it possible that she should visit the chateau before she left Le Puy, but that she would give him an answer at dinner. The most tedious time in the day to Mrs. Thompson were the 2 hours after breakfast. At 1 o'clock she daily went to the school, taking Mimi, who for an hour or 2 shared her sister's lessons. This and her little excursions about the place, and her shopping, managed to make away with her afternoon. Then in the evening, she generally saw something of Le Cador. But those 2 hours after breakfast were hard of killing. On this occasion, when she gained her own room, she as usual placed Mimi on the sofa with a needle. Her custom then was to take up a novel, but on this morning she sat herself down in her armchair, and resting her head upon her hand and elbow, began to turn over certain circumstances in her mind. "Mamma," said Mimi, "why won't you go with Le Cador to that place belonging to the Prince Polly something, wasn't it?" "Mind your work, my dear," said Mrs. Thompson, "but I do so wish you'd go, Mamma." "What was the prince's name?" "Polignac, Mamma." "Ain't princes very great people?" "Yes, my dear, sometimes." "Is Prince Polignac like our Prince Alfred?" "No, my dear, not at all. At least, I suppose not." "Is his mother a queen?" "No, my dear." "Then his father must be a king?" "No, my dear. It is quite a different thing here. Here in France they have a great many princes." "Well, at any rate I should like to see a prince's chateau, so I do hope you'll go." And then there was a pause. "Mamma, could it come to pass, here in France, that Le Cador should ever be a prince? Le Cador a prince? No, don't talk such nonsense, but mind your work. Isn't Le Cador a very nice man? Ain't you very fond of him?" To this question Mrs. Thompson made no answer. "Mamma," continued Mimi, after a moment's pause, "won't you tell me whether you are fond of Le Cador?" "I'm quite sure of this, that he's very fond of you." "What makes you think that?" asked Mrs. Thompson, who could not bring herself to refrain from the question. "Because he looks at you in that way, Mamma, and squeezes your hand." "Nonsense, child," said Mrs. Thompson, "hold your tongue. I don't know what can have put such stuff into your head." "But he does, Mamma," said Mimi, who rarely allowed her mother to put her down. Mrs. Thompson made no further answer, but again sat with her head resting on her hand. She also, if the truth must be told, was thinking of Le Cador and his fondness for herself. He had squeezed her hand and he had looked into her face. However much it may have been nonsense on Mimi's part to talk of such things, they had not the less absolutely occurred. Was it really the fact that Le Cador was in love with her? And if so, what return should she, or could she make to such a passion? He had looked at her yesterday, and squeezed her hand today. Might it not be probable that he would advance a step further tomorrow? If so, what answer would she be prepared to make to him? She did not think so. She said to herself that she had any particular objection to marrying again. Thompson had been dead now for 4 years, and neither his friends, nor her friends, nor the world could say she was wrong on that score. And as to marrying a Frenchman, she could not say she felt within herself any absolute repugnance to doing that. Of her own country, speaking of England as such, she, in truth, knew but little and perhaps cared less. She had gone to India almost as a child, and England had not been specially kind to her on her return. She had found it dull and cold, stiff, and almost ill-natured. People there had not smiled on her and been civil as Le Cador had done. As far as England and Englishmen were considered, she saw no reason why she should not marry Le Cador. And then, as regarded the man, could she in her heart say that she was prepared to love, honor, and obey Le Cador? She certainly knew no reason why she should not do so. She did not know much of him, she said to herself at first, but she knew as much, she said afterwards, as she had known personally of Mr. Thompson before their marriage. She had known, to be sure, what was Mr. Thompson's profession and what his income, or, if not, someone else had known for her. As to both these points she was quite in the dark as regarded Le Cador. Personally, she certainly did like him, as she said to herself more than once. There was a courtesy and softness about him which were very gratifying to her, and then, his appearance was so much in his favor. He was not very young, she acknowledged, but neither was she young herself. It was quite evident that he was fond of her children, and that he would be a kind and affectionate father to them. Indeed, there was kindness in all that he did. Should she marry again, and she put it to herself quite hypothetically, she would look for no romance in such a second marriage. She would be content to sit down in a quiet home, to the tame dull realities of life, satisfied with the companionship of a man who would be kind and gentle to her, and whom she could respect and esteem. Where could she find a companion with whom this could be more safely anticipated than with Le Cador? And so she argued the question within her own breast in a manner not unfriendly to the gentleman. That there was as yet one great hindrance she at once saw, but then that might be remedied by a word. She did not know what was his income or his profession. The chambermaid, whom she had interrogated, had told her that he was a marchand. To merchants, generally, she felt that she had no objection. The Barings and the Rothschilds were merchants, as was also that wonderful man at Bombay, Sir Homaji Bomaji, who was worth she did know how many thousand lakhs of rupees. That it would behove her, on her own account and that of her daughters, to take care of her own little fortune in contracting any such connection, that she felt strongly. She would never so commit herself as to put security in that respect out of her power. But then she did not think that Le Cador would ever ask her to do so. At any rate, she was determined on this, that there should never be any doubt on that matter, and as she firmly resolved on this, she again took up her book, and for a minute or two made an attempt to read. "Mamma," said Mummy, "will Le Cador go up to the school to see Lillian when you go away from this?" "Indeed, I cannot say, my dear. If Lillian is a good girl, perhaps he may do so now and then. And will he write to you and tell you how she is?" "Lillian can write for herself, can she not?" "Oh yes, I suppose she can, but I hope Le Cador will write too. We shall come back here some day, shan't we, Mamma?" "I cannot say, my dear. I do so hope we shall see Le Cador again." "Do you know what I was thinking, Mamma? Little girls like you ought not to think," said Mrs. Thompson, walking slowly out of the room to the top of the stairs and back again, for she had felt the necessity of preventing Mimi from disclosing any more of her thoughts. "And now, my dear, get yourself ready, and we will go up to the school." Mrs. Thompson always dressed herself with care, though not in especially fine clothes, before she went down to dinner at the table d'hôte, but on this occasion she was more than usually particular. She hardly explained to herself why she did this, but, nevertheless, as she stood before the glass, she did in a certain manner feel that the circumstances of her future life might perhaps depend on what might be said and done that evening. She had not absolutely decided whether or no she would go to the prince's chateau. But if she did go, well, If she did, what then? She had sense enough, as she assured herself more than once, to regulate her own conduct with propriety in any such emergency. During the dinner, Le Cador conversed in his usual manner, but said nothing whatever about the visit to Polignac. He was very kind to Mimi, and very courteous to her mother, but did not appear to be at all more particular than usual. Indeed, it might be a question whether he was not less so. As she had entered the room, Mrs. Thompson had said to herself that, perhaps, after all, it would be better that there should be nothing more thought about it, but before the 4 or 5 courses were over, she was beginning to feel a little disappointed. And now the fruit was on the table, after the consumption of which it was her practice to retire. It was certainly open to her to ask Le Cador to take tea with her that evening, as she had done on former occasions, but she felt that she must not do this now, considering the immediate circumstances of the case. If any further steps were to be taken, they must be taken by him, and not by her or else by Mimi, who, just as her mother was slowly consuming her last grapes, ran round to the back of Le Cador's chair, and whispered something into his ear. It may be presumed that Mrs. Thompson did not see the intention of the movement in time to arrest it, for she did nothing till the whispering had been whispered, and then she rebuked the child, bade her not to be troublesome, and with more than usual austerity in her voice, desired her to get herself ready to go upstairs to their chamber. As she spoke she herself rose from her chair, and made her final little bow to the table, and her other final little bow and smile to Le Cador, but this was certain to all who saw it, that the smile was not as gracious as usual. As she walked forth, Le Cador rose from his chair, such being his constant practice when she left the table, but on this occasion he accompanied her to the door. "And has Madame decided," he asked, "whether she will permit me to accompany her to the chateau?" "Well, I really don't know," said Mrs. Thompson. "Miss Mimi," continued Le Cador, "is very anxious to see the rock, and I may perhaps hope that Miss Lillian would be pleased with such a little excursion. As for myself," and then Le Cador put his hand upon his heart in a manner that seemed to speak more plainly than he had ever spoken. "Well, if the children would really like it, and as you are so very kind," said Mrs. Thompson, and so the matter was conceded. "Tomorrow afternoon?" suggested Le Cador. But Mrs. Thompson fixed on Saturday, thereby showing that she herself was in no hurry for the expedition. "Oh, I am so glad," said Mimi, when they had re-entered their own room. "Mamma, do let me tell Lillian myself when I go up to the school tomorrow." But Mamma was in no humor to say much to her child on this subject at the present moment. She threw herself back on her sofa in perfect silence, and began to reflect whether she would like to sign her name in future as Fanny Le Cador, instead of Fanny Thompson. It certainly seemed as though things were verging towards such a necessity. A marquand. But a marquand of what? She had an instinctive feeling that the people in the hotel were talking about her and Le Cador, and was therefore more than ever averse to asking anyone a question. As she went up to the school the next afternoon, she walked through more of the streets of Le Puy than was necessary, and in every street she looked at the names which she saw over the doors of the more respectable houses of business. But she looked in vain. It might be that Le Cador was a marquand of so specially high a quality as to be under no necessity to put up his name at all. Sir Homaji Bomaji's name did not appear over any door in Bombay at least. She thought not. And then came the Saturday morning. "We shall be ready at 2, she said, as she left the breakfast table, "and perhaps you would not mind calling for Lillian on the way." Le Cador would be delighted to call anywhere for anybody on behalf of Mrs. Thompson, and then, as he got to the door of the salon, he offered her his hand. He did so with so much French courtesy that she could not refuse it, and then she felt that his purpose was more tender than ever it had been. And why not, if this was the destiny which fate had prepared for her? Mrs. Thompson would rather have got into the carriage at any other spot in Le Puy than at that at which she was forced to do so, the chief entrance, namely, of the Hotel des Ambassadors. And what made it worse was this, that an appearance of a special fate was given to the occasion. Le Cador was dressed in more than his Sunday best. He had on new yellow kid gloves. His coat, if not new, was newer than any Mrs. Thompson had yet observed, and was lined with silk up to the very collar. He had on patent leather boots, which glittered, as Mrs. Thompson thought, much too conspicuously. And as for his hat, it was quite evident that it was fresh that morning from the maker's block. In this costume, with his hat in his hand, he stood under the great gateway of the hotel, ready to hand Mrs. Thompson into the carriage. This would have been nothing if the landlord and landlady had not been there also, as well as the man cook, and the 4 waiters, and the Filder chamber. 2 or 3 other pair of eyes Mrs. Thompson also saw, as she glanced round, and then Mimi walked across the yard in her best clothes with a fete-day air about her for which her mother would have liked to have whipped her, but what did it matter? If it was written in the book that she should become Madame Lecador, of course the world would know that there must have been some preparatory love-making. Let them have their laugh, a good husband would not be dearly purchased at so trifling an expense. And so they sallied forth with already half the ceremony of a wedding. Mimi seated herself opposite to her mother, and M. Lecador also sat with his back to the horses, leaving the second place of honor for Lillian. "Pray make yourself comfortable, M. Lecador, and don't mind her," said Mrs. Thompson. But he was firm in his purpose of civility, perhaps making up his mind that when he should in truth stand in the place of papa to the young lady, then would be his time for having the back seat in the carnage. Lillian, also in her best frock, came down the school steps, and 3 of the school teachers came with her. It would have added to Mrs. Thompson's happiness at that moment if M. Lecador would have kept his polished boots out of sight, and put his yellow gloves into his pocket, and then they started. The road from Le Puy to Polignac is nearly all uphill, and a very steep hill it is, so that there was plenty of time for conversation. But the girls had it nearly all to themselves. Mimi thought that she had never found M. Lecador so stupid, and Lillian told her sister on the first safe opportunity that occurred, that it seemed very much as though they were all going to church. "And do any of the Polignac people ever live at this place?" asked Mrs. Thompson, by way of making conversation, in answer to which M. Lecador informed Madame that the place was at present only a ruin, and then there was again silence till they found themselves under the rock, and were informed by the driver that the rest of the ascent must be made on foot. The rock now stood abrupt and precipitous above their heads. It was larger in its circumference and with much larger space on its summit than those other volcanic rocks in and close to the town, but then at the same time it was higher from the ground, and quite as inaccessible, except by the single path which led up to the chateau. M. Lecador, with conspicuous gallantry, first assisted Mrs. Thompson from the carriage, and then handed down the 2 young ladies. No lady could have been so difficult to please as to complain of him, and yet Mrs. Thompson thought that he was not as agreeable as usual. Those horrid boots and those horrid gloves gave him such an air of holiday finery that neither could he be at his ease wearing them, nor could she, in seeing them worn. They were soon taken in hand by the poor woman whose privilege it was to show the ruins. For a little distance they walked up the path in single file, not that it was too narrow to accommodate 2, but M. Lecador's courage had not yet been screwed to a point which admitted of his offering his arm to the widow. For in France, it must be remembered, that this means more than it does in some other countries. Mrs. Thompson felt that all this was silly and useless. If they were not to be dear friends this coming out fating together, those boots and gloves and new hat were all very foolish, and if they were, the sooner they understood each other the better. So Mrs. Thompson, finding that the path was steep and the weather warm, stood still for a while leaning against the wall, with a look of considerable fatigue in her face. "Will Madame permit me the honor of offering her my arm?" said M. Lecador. "The road is so extraordinarily steep for Madame to climb." Mrs. Thompson did permit him the honor, and so they went on till they reached the top. The view from the summit was both extensive and grand, but neither Lillian nor Mimi were much pleased with the place. The elder sister, who had talked over the matter with her school companions, expected a fine castle with turrets, battlements, and romance, and the other expected a pretty smiling house, such as princes, in her mind, ought to inhabit. Instead of this they found an old turret, with steps so broken that M. Lecador did not care to ascend them, and the ruined walls of a mansion, in which nothing was to be seen but the remains of an enormous kitchen chimney. It was the kitchen of the family, said the guide. "Oh," said Mrs. Thompson, "and this," said the woman, taking them into the next ruined compartment, "was the kitchen of Monsieur et Madame." "What? 2 kitchens?" exclaimed Lillian, upon which M. Lecador explained that the ancestors of the Prince de Polignac had been very great people, and had therefore acquired culinary performances on a great scale. And then the woman began to chatter something about an oracle of Apollo. There was, she said, a hole in the rock, from which in past times, perhaps more than 100 years ago, the oracle used to speak forth mysterious words. There, she said, pointing to a part of the rock at some distance, was the hole. And if the ladies would follow her to a little outhouse which was just beyond, she would show them the huge stone mouth out of which the oracle used to speak. Lillian and Mimi both declared at once for seeing the oracle, but Mrs. Thompson expressed her determination to remain sitting where she was upon the turf. So the guide started off with the young ladies, and will it be thought surprising that M. Lecador should have remained alone by the side of Mrs. Thompson? It must be now or never, Mrs. Thompson felt, and as regarded Le Cador, he probably entertained some idea of the same kind. Mrs. Thompson's inclinations, though they had never been very strong in the matter, were certainly in favor of the now. Le Cador's inclinations were stronger. He had fully and firmly made up his mind in favor of matrimony, but then he was not so absolutely in favor of the now. Mrs. Thompson's mind, if one could have read it, would have shown a great objection to shilly-shallying, as she was accustomed to call it. But Le Cador, were it not for the danger which might thence arise, would have seen no objection to some slight further procrastination. His courage was beginning, perhaps, to ooze out from his fingers' ends. "I declare that those girls have scampered away ever so far," said Mrs. Thompson. "Would Madam wish that I should call them back?" said Le Cador, innocently. "Oh, no, dear children. Let them enjoy themselves. It will be a pleasure to them to run about the rock, and I suppose they will be safe with that woman." "Oh, yes, quite safe," said Le Cador, and then there was another little pause. Mrs. Thompson was sitting on a broken fragment of a stone just outside the entrance to the old family kitchen, and Le Cador was standing immediately before her. He had in his hand a little cane with which he sometimes slapped his boots and sometimes poked about among the rubbish. His hat was not quite straight on his head, having a little jaunty twist to one side, with reference to which, by the by, Mrs. Thompson then resolved that she would make a change, should ever the gentleman become her own property. He still wore his gloves, and was very smart, but it was clear to see that he was not at his ease. "I hope the heat does not incommode you," he said after a few moments' silence. Mrs. Thompson declared that it did not, that she liked a good deal of heat, and that, on the whole, she was very well where she was. She was afraid, however, that she was detaining Le Cador, who might probably wish to be moving about upon the rock. In answer to which Le Cador declared that he never could be so happy anywhere as in her close vicinity. "You are too good to me," said Mrs. Thompson, almost sighing. "I don't know what my stay here would have been without your great kindness." "It is Madam that has been kind to me," said Le Cador, pressing the handle of his cane against his heart. There was then another pause, after which Mrs. Thompson said that that was all his French politeness, that she knew that she had been very troublesome to him, but that she would now soon be gone, and that then, in her own country, she would never forget his great goodness. "Ah, Madame," said Le Cador, and, as he said it, much more was expressed in his face than in his words. "But, then, you can neither accept nor reject a gentleman by what he says in his face." He blushed, too, up to his grizzled hair, and, turning round, walked a step or two away from the widow's seat, and back again. Mrs. Thompson the while sat quite still. The displaced fragment, lying, as it did, near a corner of the building, made not an uncomfortable chair. She had only to be careful that she did not injure her hat or crush her clothes, and throw in a word here and there to assist the gentleman, should occasion permit it. "Madame," said Le Cador, on his return from a second little walk. "Monsieur," replied Mrs. Thompson, perceiving that Le Cador paused in his speech. "Madame," he began again, and then, as he again paused, Mrs. Thompson looked up to him very sweetly. "Madame, what I am going to say will, I am afraid, seem to evince by far too great audacity on my part." Mrs. Thompson may, perhaps, have thought that, at the present moment, audacity was not his fault. She replied, however, that she was quite sure that Monsieur would say nothing that was in any way unbecoming either for him to speak or for her to hear. "Madame, may I have ground to hope that such may be your sentiments after I have spoken?" "Madam," and now he went down, absolutely on his knees, on the hard stones, and Mrs. Thompson, looking about into the distance, almost thought that she saw the top of the guide's cap. "Madam, I have looked forward to this opportunity as one in which I may declare for you the greatest passion that I have ever yet felt. Madame, with all my heart and soul I love you. Madame, I offer to you the homage of my heart, my hand, the happiness of my life, and all that I possess in this world." And then, taking her hand gracefully between his gloves, he pressed his lips against the tips of her fingers. If the thing was to be done, this way of doing it was, perhaps, as good as any other. It was one, at any rate, which left no doubt whatever as to the gentleman's intentions. Mrs. Thompson, could she have had her own way, would not have allowed her lover of 50 to go down upon his knees, and would have spared him much of the romance of his declaration. So also would she have spared him his yellow gloves and his polished boots. But these were a part of the necessity of the situation, and therefore she wisely took them as matters to be passed over with indifference. Seeing, however, that Lecador still remained on his knees. It was necessary that she should take some step toward raising him, especially as her 2 children and the guide would infallibly be upon them before long. Lecador, she said, you surprise me greatly, but pray get up. But will Madame vouchsafe to give me some small ground for hope? The girls will be here directly. Lecador, pray get up. I can talk to you much better if you will stand up, or sit down on one of these stones. Lecador did as he was bid. He got up, wiped the knees of his pantaloons with his handkerchief, sat down beside her, and then pressed the handle of his cane to his heart. You really have so surprised me that I hardly know how to answer you, said Mrs. Thompson. Indeed, I cannot bring myself to imagine that you are in earnest. Ah, madame, do not be so cruel. How can I have lived with you so long, sat beside you for so many days, without having received your image into my heart? I am in earnest. Alas! I fear too much in earnest. And then he looked at her with all his eyes, and sighed with all his strength. Mrs. Thompson's prudence told her that it would be well to settle the matter, in one way or the other, as soon as possible. Long periods of love-making were fit for younger people than herself and her future possible husband. Her object would be to make him comfortable if she could, and that he should do the same for her, if that also were possible. As for lookings and sighings and pressings of the hand, she had gone through all that some 20 years since in India, when Thompson had been young, and she was still in her teens. But, Lecador, there are so many things to be considered. There. I hear the children coming. Let us walk this way for a minute. And they turned behind a wall which placed them out of sight, and walked on a few paces till they reached a parapet, which stood on the uttermost edge of the high rock. Leaning upon this they continued their conversation. There are so many things to be considered, said Mrs. Thompson again. Yes, of course, said Lecador. But my one great consideration is this semicolon that I love Madame to distraction. I am very much flattered, of course, any lady would so feel. But, Lecador. Madame, I am all attention. But, if you would deign to make me happy, say that one word, I love you. Lecador, as he uttered these words, did not look, as the saying is, at his best. But Mrs. Thompson forgave him. She knew that elderly gentlemen under such circumstances do not look at their best. But if I consented to such an arrangement, I could only do so on seeing that it would be beneficial or, at any rate, not injurious to my children, and that it would offer to ourselves a fair promise of future happiness. Ah, madame, it would be the dearest wish of my heart to be a second further to those 2 young ladies, except, indeed. And then Lecador stopped the flow of his speech. In such matters it is so much the best to be explicit at once, said Mrs. Thompson. Oh, yes, certainly. Nothing can be more wise than madam, and the happiness of a household depends so much on money. Madame, let me say a word or two, Monsieur Lecador. I have enough for myself and my children, and, should I ever marry again, I should not, I hope, be felt as a burden by my husband, but it would, of course, be my duty to know what were his circumstances before I accepted him. Of yourself, personally, I have seen nothing that I do not like. Oh, madame, but as yet I know nothing of your circumstances. Lecador, perhaps, did feel that Mrs. Thompson's prudence was of a strong, masculine description, but he hardly liked her the less on this account. To give him his due, he was not desirous of marrying her solely for her money's sake. He also wished for a comfortable home, and proposed to give as much as he got, only he had been anxious to wrap up the solid cake of this business in a casing of sugar of romance. Mrs. Thompson would not have the sugar, but the cake might not be the worse on that account. No, madame, not as yet, but they shall all be made open and at your disposal, said Lecador, and Mrs. Thompson bowed approvingly. I am in business, continued Lecador, and my business gives me 8,000 francs a year. 4 times 8 are 32, said Mrs. Thompson to herself, putting the francs into pounds sterling, in the manner that she had always found to be the readiest. Well, so far the statement was satisfactory. An income of £320 a year from business, joined to her own, might do very well. She did not in the least suspect Lecador of being false, and so far the matter sounded well. And what is the business? She asked, in a tone of voice intended to be indifferent, but which nevertheless showed that she listened anxiously for an answer to her question. They were both standing with their arms upon the wall, looking down upon the town of Le Puy, but they had so stood that each could see the other's countenance as they talked. Mrs. Thompson could now perceive that Lecador became red in the face, as he paused before answering her. She was near to him, and seeing his emotion gently touched his arm with her hand. This she did to reassure him, for she saw that he was ashamed of having to declare that he was a tradesman. As for herself, she had made up her mind to bear with this, if she found, as she felt sure she would find, that the trade was one which would not degrade either him or her. Hitherto, indeed, in her early days, she had looked down on trade, but of what benefit had her grand ideas been to her when she had returned to England? She had tried her hand at English genteel society, and no one had seemed to care for her. Therefore, she touched his arm lightly with her fingers that she might encourage him. He paused for a moment, as I have said, and became red, and then feeling that he had shown some symptoms of shame and feeling also, probably, that it was unmanly in him to do so, he shook himself slightly, raised his head up somewhat more proudly than was his wont, looked her full in the face with more strength of character than she had yet seen him assume, and then, declared his business. "Madame," he said, in a very audible, but not in a loud voice, "Madame Chateau's tale." And having so spoken, he turned slightly from her and looked down over the valley towards Le Puy. There was nothing more said upon the subject as they drove down from the rock of Polignac back to the town. Immediately on receiving the announcement, Mrs. Thompson found that she had no answer to make. She withdrew her hand and felt at once that she had received a blow. It was not that she was angry with M. Le Cadeau for being a tailor, nor was she angry with him in that, being a tailor, he had so addressed her. But she was surprised, disappointed, and altogether put beyond her ease. She had, at any rate, not expected this. She had dreamed of his being a banker, thought that, perhaps, he might have been a wine merchant, but her idea had never gone below a jeweler or watchmaker. When those words broke upon her ear, "Madame Chateau's tale," she had felt herself to be speechless, but the words have not been a minute spoken when Lillian and Mimi ran up to their mother. "Oh, Mamma," said Lillian, "we thought you were lost. We have searched for you all over the chateau. We have been sitting very quietly here, my dear, looking at the view," said Mrs. Thompson. "But, Mamma, I do wish you'd see the mouth of the oracle. It is so large, and so round, and so ugly." "I put my arm into it all the way," said Mimi, but at the present moment her mamma felt no interest in the mouth of the oracle, and so they all walked down together to the carriage. And, though the way was steep, Mrs. Thompson managed to pick her steps without the assistance of an arm, nor did M. Le Cadeau presume to offer it. The drive back to town was very silent. Mrs. Thompson did make one or two attempts at conversation, but they were not effectual. M. Le Cadeau could not speak at his ease till this matter was settled, and he already had begun to perceive that his business was against him. Why is it that the trade of a tailor should be less honorable than that of a haberdasher, or even a grocer? They sat next each other at dinner, as usual, and here, as all eyes were upon them, they both made a great struggle to behave in their accustomed way. But even in this they failed. All the world of the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs knew that M. Le Cadeau had gone forth to make an offer to Mrs. Thompson, and all that world, therefore, was full of speculation. But all the world could make nothing of it. M. Le Cadeau did look like a rejected man, but Mrs. Thompson did not look like the woman who had rejected him. That the offer had been made and that everybody agreed, from the senior habitué of the house who always sat at the head of the table, down to the junior assistant Garkin. But as to reading the riddle, there was no accord among them. When the dessert was done, Mrs. Thompson, as usual, withdrew, and M. Le Cadeau, as usual, bowed as he stood behind his own chair. He did not, however, attempt to follow her, but when she reached the door she called him. He was at her side in a moment, and then she whispered in his ear, "And I, also I will be of the same business." When M. Le Cadeau regained the table, the senior habitué, the junior Garkin, and all the intermediate ranks of men at the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs knew that they might congratulate him. Mrs. Thompson had made a great struggle, but, speaking for myself, I am inclined to think that she arrived at last at a wise decision.